All right, welcome back everyone. In this next session, we have a live discussion about what investors are looking for, what projects are gaining traction, and what you need to know to get investors interested. On our panel, we have Roy Høias, founder and CEO of Lighthouse Finance AS. Welcome, Roy.
Thank you, Jean. Hi.
Next, we have Jamie Stein, co-founder of Devonian Capital. Hi, Jamie.
Hi, Jean. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. And we have Erik Tveteraas, investment director of Nutreco. Hi, Erik.
Hi, Jean, and good morning or afternoon to the audience.
Yes, welcome everyone. So we will have an opportunity for audiences to ask their own questions to our panelists at the end. So send them on the chat right now and I'll be able to keep an eye on them. But first, let's start with some introductions. Roy, I'll start with you. If you could give us a brief overview of your organization and what drew you to the RAS projects that you're currently involved in.
Yeah, obviously, we'd be happy to do that. Looking at Lighthouse, we obviously, coming from Norway, we were in an early stage looking at RAS solutions in the salmon farming industry on the smolt production. So that was obviously an important part for us to early stage to understand that. Since Lighthouse has been developing their operation globally, and we are operating today from Norway, Denmark, India, and the US, that has also given us the opportunity to look at several cases, several opportunities. But the basic of the knowledge and the background is coming from the early stage where we were working with the traditional salmon farmers that have been using RAS technology for smolt and big smolt production for many years.
Jamie, I'll ask you as well the same question, a brief overview of Devonian Capital and what drew you to the RAS projects that you're involved in.
There was going to be one, wasn't there? Thank you, Jean. So back in 2014, my partners and I started looking at some RAS projects as investors. We'd worked in renewable energy and we were getting very excited about these projects from a sustainability perspective, as well as from a financial perspective, with the potential for rolling out more projects with lower cost capital as the model was proven. But we found it very hard to be confident as investors ourselves that the projects we were looking at were going to be the ones that succeeded. So we felt that there was a gap in the market for a group that could help investors to understand the risks of this space, could identify the businesses that were likely to succeed, and then could work with those businesses to help them achieve their goals. So we set up Devonian 4 years ago and brought in my partner Andre as a key part of the team. Andre is the fish farmer on the team with a deep experience of RAS as well as other forms of fish farming. So having Andre on board let us invest our own money with more confidence, and it's something that the companies we work with really value as well. In terms of what drew us to the projects we're currently involved in, it's a few things. So each of them had a vision for how to build a solid foundation and then scale the business. Each of them was early stage, which we like as we feel we can add more value. They're all in the US, which we really like as a market for RAS for a number of reasons. And they represent some of the key species, so salmon, tilapia, and shrimp. So we feel we've got a broad coverage of the species.
And Erik, tell us a little bit about Nutreco and the RAS projects that you're involved in.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Erik Tveteraas. Obviously, you can tell by the name, I'm part of actually part of what we call Nutreco New Frontiers, which is the corporate venture arm of Nutreco. We've been a little bit under the radar. We've not been that visible, but we started in 2017. Mainly looking at venture opportunities in the feed additives and precision farming and animal health space. And then we augmented that original mandate in 2019, where we really saw an inflection point in the RAS space, that it was about to become more mainstream. There were more projects being developed. There was more investor interest being generated, especially from for example, Atlantic Sapphire has obviously been very visible in this space. And we saw it primarily for us as a strategic investor. We're coming at this from an industrial viewpoint, and what we're seeing in conventional aquaculture, especially in salmon, is that there are certain barriers for growth, especially on the regulatory and the biological side, which in the medium to longer term would prove a challenge in terms of meeting global demand, which we think is and will be continue to be robust. Projects are obviously early stage and greenfield, and they fit squarely in the venture remit that we have in Nutreco New Frontiers. So that's our angle in it.
Thanks, everyone. Roy, what do you look for when assessing a RAS project as a potential investment? Are there certain criteria or indicators that you're looking for before you start conversations?
So was that for me or was it back for?
It was for Roy.
Okay. Yeah. We are obviously having looked at several cases over the past 5-6 years. It has been a quite good steep learning curve in that sense to understand. But what we have, and it's obviously covering the understanding of the complete business model is what we look at, and you have a priority 1, 2, and 3, and we are usually starting with looking at the people, and that is one of the key challenges in generally today, is that there are not many specialized RAS farmers out there. And obviously that is a very important part. The second part we look at is obviously the technology supplier. Which one are they choosing to go for? And there are several solutions out there, and we have a preference of some of them due to that we don't really like if it's just a solution that you deliver and then you go away and leave your clients to fix it. We like to see that the RAS suppliers are involved in some sense of either in the business or as a support services agreement for the next 2 to 3 years. And then obviously the species. I mean, we started with salmon and trout. We know that very well, but obviously since we also have established our operation in India, covering Asia, we are today quite advanced into the shrimp farming, yellowtail and other species. And understanding the scope of that is obviously important. But when we have that picture ready, more or less, it's all about understanding also the circular industry model of how this industry is working. We have seen too many presentations where everyone is talking about the production cost, growth rate, price of per kilo salmon in the market, but it is a value chain. And you need to understand the total value chain. And if we see cases that is not covering that is obviously not our preferred cases to go in. And what we do is actually the case we work with and work on our task is to provide the complete capital lending part of the capex investment. So obviously we need to be sure and we need to believe, but knowledge is at the moment one of the key issues.
Jamie, how about you? What are the first indicators or first criteria that you look at when you're looking at a project for potential investment?
Yeah, it was fun listening to Roy there, because I kind of feel like I'm just going to say pretty much the same thing as Roy said. So we invest in early stage businesses rather than in projects. So we're approaching it more with a venture capital / growth mindset. But often those groups won't have a facility up and running when we start speaking with them. That said, as Roy says, the team's critical. We want to understand their experience and assess how realistic their plan is and how realistic they are about the challenges and the opportunities in this space. We want to look at the market. We're looking ideally for relatively deep markets with proven price points. So if there's established demand through the grocer channel for the product, then that's a big plus for us. And of course, we look at the technology. We've got a strong bias to people who are going to use proven technology. So we want to be able to visit farms that are using that technology and speak to the farmers that are using that technology. We then look at the financial metrics from a P&L perspective. So the CapEx per ton, the price per kilo, the OpEx per ton, try and figure out if we think they're realistic. And then obviously we look at the financing of the business, the planned level of leverage and the valuation that we're being asked to invest at, to help us understand whether this is a good investment opportunity.
For you, Erik, anything to add in terms of what are good indicators for you in a RAS investment?
Yeah, so specifically for Nutreco, the kind of first stage gate that we look at is geographic. So we and you'll see that in our portfolio as well. So we have and tend to prefer projects that are in what we call airborne markets. So preferably fairly large established markets with a certain growth potential that are not in the traditional producing regions. So we have, for example, from our portfolio as an example, we invested in West Coast Salmon in the US and Proximar, Japan, and Nordic Aqua Partners in China. And part of the reason for that is that we fundamentally in our investment thesis, we do not have a very strong belief in a sustained high level of premium pricing once volumes start to kick off. But what we do believe in is the more sort of let's call them hard realities of entry costs for traditional producers. So freight and handling and other logistics costs, which gives an edge for certain projects in the markets that I just mentioned. So that's the first stage gate and criteria for us. Secondly, we only look at species that are already industrialized and developed. So Atlantic salmon and shrimp are preferred species, and that has to do with just the overall risk profile for RAS is quite high, being early stage companies. So we want to at least reduce the risk where we can, such as market risk. Hence the focus on those species. With one exception, notable exception, we did invest in the Kingfish company. That's actually the very first investment we made. So there are exceptions to the rule. And then company specific, I'll chime in what Roy and Jamie already mentioned about know-how and technical competence. We've actually over the course of the last 2 years, our mindset has kind of ventured in more in the direction of we'd really like to see very strong engineering competence, and perhaps in engineering fields that are not usually associated with farming, such as process engineering, chemical engineering, and just really strong knowledge on water treatment, water quality. So that's what we look for in the team mix. And then also a credible financing strategy is also something that we put quite high emphasis on. So as an example, we wouldn't be wouldn't be comfortable investing alone as the sole anchor investor. We would like to see other investors with deep pockets in the same deals that would be able to follow on with further investment as the company scales up.
Now, you're all very experienced in the RAS sector, but for those who are just getting interested and looking into the sector, are there specific challenges of, do you have any advice for them in terms of understanding the tech or understanding the market in general? What do you guys foresee might be like the obstacles to understanding the RAS sector? Roy, I'll start with you. Oh, Roy, I think you're still on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, that's a good question. If I had the answer to that, I would probably be doing the RAS farming by myself. But no. I mean, it's hard to put the finger on one thing or two things, because understanding the complete of farming it's actually where the opposite is. If you see somebody who is not covering all the important items in the total value chain, that is where you're going to lose, I think, the opportunity. When I'm looking at cases and through the years, they have been a huge development on the first PowerPoint I saw, and that was actually Atlantic Sapphire several years ago, and that was quite different what you see today. And I think my best advice is that when they are entering into this, they need to be able to cover the whole, what we define as the value chain. It starts with genetic. If you want to do that, you need to have a clear strategy on where are you going to buy the starting point of the fish. You're going to buy some eggs, and you need to have a strategy on that. And then you go to the feed. I mean, Erik is one partner that you should definitely have on board and talking to. You need to have a RAS technology strategy. You need to have an offtake downstream, as we call it, strategy on go-to-market and how are you going to process the fish, creating the value of the fish. And then you're back to the core of it. Then you need to have uncommitted people that really are farmers, water treatment engineering, and business people, and that is the combination you need to put together. And if you are able to do that, then I think you have a really competitive case. But if you're in lack of something, you are in a position where you probably will reveal that you maybe doesn't have quite yet the knowledge you should have. That's the hard facts, actually.
Jimmy, how about you? What do investors need to know when they start doing business in the RAS sector?
So for investors to think about this, they've got to think about, I guess, their ability to assess a whole bunch of different parameters. There's sort of three things that you need to get right. And then there's a lot of detail, as Roy said, behind each of those three things. So you've got to build something that's going to work, and you've got to build it for a reasonable cost, and you've got to make sure that it can be maintained. So investors need to be able to form a judgment about the level of detail to which the management team of that RAS business has gone in procuring that technology. Have they actually, are they trying to slightly do it themselves, or have they gone all the way through to a fully procured design and build from a third-party supplier, or is it a bit of the two? And it's not to say that one or other approach is right or wrong, but whatever they do has to match with the experience set of the core team. You've then got to grow the fish, and that's everything from eggs through to the harvesting. And there's a number of different stages in that where things can go wrong. And then you've got to sell the product and keep it at a consistently high quality. So the investors have to be able to understand all of those different aspects and form a judgment on the team's competence to do those things. And experience and realism are really important here, because if a RAS project goes really well, it will deliver against the business plan, and maybe if it's done exceptionally well, it might do a little bit more production. But if you get something wrong, you can start to do quite a lot less than the business plan, because the fish grow, the fish really don't like not being treated well. And they're pretty happy to not eat if they're not being looked after. So really it's about assessing the team's ability across those 3 key areas, and then within those there's a bunch of disciplines within that. And I think that's the challenge that we identified when we set up Devonian, was that there were just not many groups that were able to do that alongside the investors and try and help them make that determination, because that's not, that level of understanding of the industry is not very widespread in the investor community, for obvious reasons, because it's not even very widespread within the RAS sector itself, because it's a relatively young sector.
Erik, what about you? You mentioned before that your your interest is narrowed to specific species. Is that a good strategy in terms of fully understanding the projects that you could potentially be investing in?
Sorry, could you repeat that question? How do we?
You mentioned earlier that that your interests are for specific species that are raised in RAS. Is that a good strategy for an investor coming in and just picking a species or picking a specific sector where they could fully understand, or is it, to Roy's point, where you have to really just understand the entire value chain as a whole?
Yeah, I think to be frank, from a risk mitigation viewpoint, there's been highlighted some operational risks which are there in RAS, no matter what, especially in the early ramp up phase, where a number of things can go wrong, from could be design issues or just mismanagement by lack of know-how and expertise. As long as it's at least an established species where you know a lot about the biology, and where there's already feed that's been specifically tailored and developed for that species, for at least for us as an investor, that is critical. And to pull on that thread a little bit, we know, and we're acutely aware of that. In RAS system, you're not just feeding the fish, you're feeding the entire system. So at least by focusing on those key species, you mitigate against that. Now there might be exceptions to that if there is a very credible local niche species that has an established offtake or distribution channel for that already, then that's a different proposition, but that's not something that we specifically look for.
Roy, do you have particular areas of interest along the RAS value chain, or do you feel like there are particular, as Maggie mentioned, ancillary sectors that do you feel is a little bit under the radar that investors should keep an eye on? Sorry, Roy, you're on mute again.
I'm always getting that. I apologize.
Okay.
I think, well, it's easy to see in the newspaper and the press that it's salmon. It's in the coverage, and from Lighthouse, we are equally involved in other RAS projects with other species as we are with salmon and trout. We think that first of all, that RAS technology and land-based farming is going to be a very sustainable way of farming in the future. So it's a bigger picture for us than just on the species, but it's also obviously important that there are an off-take market to take off the species that is going to be farmed. At the moment, I would say that obviously salmon and trout is very interesting volume markets. We have a specific focus on yellowtail. We think that is definitely a species we like to see, and we are big believers that that is going to be a huge land-based part of the farming in the future. We also see shrimp farming. Farming of shrimp in the RAS system is probably one of the biggest opportunities we look at the moment. So there has been other species as Tilapia, Barramundi, and so on, but I would say this is our main focus today, actually.
Jamie, for you, do you feel there are specific areas of interest that are under the radar for most investors?
Yeah, so across the value chain, I mean, obviously we're heavily focused on the production side, so we're not particularly focused on the technologies that serve the industry, because we think that value will come to the farmers who get the farming right. There's one transaction that we're currently finalizing, which speaks to a couple of areas of interest that we have, which is a tilapia hatchery, which has got a couple of very attractive brood lines. So we like tilapia because we think that it's a relatively inexpensive fish with a low environmental footprint, and we think it can become even cheaper and produce a high quality protein, and ultimately, you know, could help take seafood to compete further with terrestrial proteins. So we're maybe a little unusual in our enthusiasm for tilapia as a play here. We do like hatcheries as part of the value chain because it's a key industry bottleneck. You've got to have good quality genetics, or you can't make your RAS work, or your RAS business work rather. And we're also making our first non-farming investment into a technology platform which will support farmers by giving them better access to information on how the fish and the equipment and the water quality are interacting. So helping those people who do have experience potentially to be able to monitor more farms at the same time, which we think is quite an interesting gap in the market at the moment.
What about you, Erik? What are the investment areas that you're keeping a close eye on?
No, it's definitely predominantly on the farming side. We also recognize that there are certain niche technology areas which are interesting in and of themselves. For example, if someone could invent something that would take away the need for purging completely, or something that you could dramatically reduce the risk of mass mortality events in RAS. That's something that we wouldn't invest in that ourselves. We think maybe those opportunities would naturally belong more with the technology providers. That being said, from a small venture play, there could be very niche companies out there that could be compelling for an investor, but not for us as a strategic investor.
Before we go into the audience questions here, I'll do one last question. I'll start with you, Roy. What is something that you wish RAS producers know when they're in conversation with investors?
What I want them to know when I talk to the investors.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any advice? What do you wish they knew when they're in conversation with investors? What questions do you feel like they need to answer right away?
I think when listen, and I've been joining some clients with the client to the investors, and also be sitting on the other sides. I've been on both sides of the table several times, depending on each case. My view and thoughts about that is that I'm falling back to the best way you can go to the investor is actually do your homework and find out where they are and what they have of knowledge, because that is where you need to start. It's a very different knowledge level on the investors out there. And that's where you need to understand on which level they are before you go in, because otherwise you are in a challenging situation where you can actually communicate outside the line of communication with the investors. We see very, very wide knowledge difference. And sometimes we are advising our clients when they talk to investors to actually go down to the ABC of farming to understand that they are really understanding the risk and opportunities. Because that is where the market are today. I mean, Erik and Jamie are probably one of the most advanced investors in the market in that sense, and it's easier to talk to them about this than going to the family office or another investor that is just given a mandate that they want to go into the seafood industry. So my advice on the companies that want to approach investors, make sure that you do your homework on their knowledge base and adapt to that. That is probably where you can build the best trust.
What do you think, Jamie? What is something that you wish companies knew when they're proposing potential investments with you?
Thanks, Jean. So for us, it's just really important that the people who approach us are very transparent about what sits behind their plans. So, we don't expect a business plan or a team to be perfect, but we do want to work with them and try and address any weaknesses in the plan in a collaborative way. And in terms of advice to those investors, again, I think Roy gave a lot of good tips there. I think the thing we like to see is that we like to see projects that start with something small and they can prove that it works. So that can make it harder for them to access some of the larger pools of capital because the check size is potentially just too small and pushes companies more towards getting private investors to back their plan. So that's been the case in the companies that we've invested in. The other investors are mainly individuals. We like to think that they get some level of confidence from our involvement, but our advice to promoters would be to start with something small and build a solid foundation and sort of select your investors carefully to make sure that they are people who understand that they're going to be in it for the long haul, and that if they're willing to be in it for the long haul, then there's some interesting upside once they've proved that they can make something work.
And for you, Erik, do you have any advice for companies that approach you and Nutreco?
Yeah, a couple of things come to mind. I would say just have a very realistic view of timetabling in terms of racing around. Things will and do take a lot longer than I'm sure founders would like. So it's important to go into such a process with a realistic mind and recognize that that there is certainly for us there is a very extensive amount of due diligence that we do and will need to conduct, and if we're pressured on time or squeezed on time, then our default is that we just walk away from the deal. It's that simple. So just have a very realistic view of such a process. The second is something we do spend a large amount of time in diligence is assessing the stage of design and permitting. So in our experience, we've learned that there needs to be a realism on both parts in terms of the permitting risk, because we've seen time and time again that something that might seem to be completely kosher in terms of water rights and zoning and environmental permits needed, etc., is not there yet. So I would advise companies to insofar as to the extent possible, get as far as they possibly can on permitting, and make sure that you in the team that you've internalized that expertise in terms of those permitting processes, or that you have really good external advice in that matter. Those would be the two big items in my view.
Okay. Well, thanks, gentlemen. We'll transition now into our audience questions. I have a question here from Mark, and he's asking, what are the most promising species for RAS in North America? Jamie, I'll start with you.
Sure, thank you. So we've invested in a few projects so far in North America. One is a company called Local Coho. They're growing coho salmon in upstate New York. We like that because it's a slightly differentiated product, and typically attracts a bit of a price premium, certainly in the northeast of the country. We also, as I mentioned earlier, we do like tilapia, although the market for domestically produced tilapia is very small in the US, but we do think there's a potentially very significant opportunity to grow that market with a competitively priced and high quality tilapia. So we've invested in a business called Waterfield Farms, which is a little earlier stage, but it's got ambitious plans to grow tilapia, shrimp, and organic produce. And as I may have mentioned earlier, we're investing in a shrimp business. So we've just closed a small investment into a shrimp business called Royal Caribbean, which is growing shrimp in Arizona and developing a new modular technology. So salmon, tilapia, and shrimp are kind of the species that we're excited about.
Roy, I believe you also have some projects in North America. What are the most promising species for you?
At the moment, we are in trout. And that is one species that we believe has a huge potential. It's a good opportunity to salmon. So that is obviously salmon is there basically. We believe that shrimp, as Jamie explains, is coming in North America, has a huge potential. And again, we believe that yellowtail as one species that has a huge market potential. So that's those are the species we are at the moment looking at.
Erik, what's your perspective on this? What is the most promising species, do you think, for RAS in North America?
This is my answer is not going to be a surprise, I think. I've already mentioned, obviously, we have a preference for Atlantic salmon. We think North America ticks all the right boxes for that. It's a large market, high growth, great potential. And unfortunately, there's, for example, in Canada West, there's political opposition to any further growth there, even curtailing production altogether. So for sure, salmon is a species that we see huge potential in. I'll also add to that, shrimp was mentioned. We think we haven't really seen any good cases yet. We're kind of in research mode and just surveying the market. We think there is a case to be made for shrimp, not to replace big bulk, large volume frozen shrimp from, say, Ecuador, but in the fresh never frozen segment in shrimp, we think there's a potential to carve out some good niches there. And then also, obviously I have to support on yellowtail. We have a vested interest in the Kingfish company who are planning expansion in the US. So we also think yellowtail has a potential.
Someone has asked, any interest in sea plants in you three of you?
I'll take that quickly if I may.
Sure.
I mean, for us, given our focus on recirculating systems, that's not something we've looked at so far. I think sea plants have got enormous potential to help with regenerating the quality of the near shore area, but that's not something that we've looked at so far.
Erik or Roy, anything to add? Sea plants?
I can for us as a strategic investor coming from the feed industry, we need to see a direct or indirect link to the wider feed industry and the potential for feed sales and or feed development. So from that angle, we would not be interested as an investor.
Roy, I'll add to the question here. Someone else has asked, given examples of hybrid bass, barramundi, and zander. Any interest in those?
Yeah, absolutely. We have, we have some smaller active RAS systems that have done some farming on different species, and we believe they are ready to scale up. Yeah, absolutely. There are definitely other species that we are looking always out for, but it's going to be in the content of understanding the market offtake situation, and obviously also the other part, access to juveniles or genetic feed and everything. So it's a combination of that, but if they are in place, we will absolutely support other species. Absolutely.
Roy, how do you feel about aquaponic systems and hydroponic systems?
Well, I'm not a technical guy. I think that it's hard to actually give a view on that from our side. It's development going on, and I think it's probably too early to state anything. And I'm more into the focus of looking at the knowledge and people behind it. We have an approach and mindset that if the right people are there, they will work it out, as they have done in the salmon industry for many years back. In the industry, it's all about working and developing, and it's live. You have a live industry in that sense, and saying that one thing is compared to another is it's just a picture of today, but not necessarily the picture of tomorrow.
Erik, I have a question here from John Stubblefield, because you mentioned a little bit about regulatory climates in certain countries. So he asks, how much does the regulatory climate of a country factor into the decision to invest in the RAS project? Does national aquaculture policy play a big factor in decision making?
Yes, I mean, national policies do matter, but for us it's more important with just very locally on the ground. If depending on the locale and the country and the site, permitting can get politicized, which obviously a risk factor that we're not very comfortable with. So yes, I'd say they help, but it's more important for us with the local support from both on local stakeholders and local government.
How about for you, Jamie? How does the regulatory climate of or the national aquaculture policy play in deciding to invest?
Yeah, thank you, Jean. So I think one of the reasons we like the US is that there is lots of land and lots of water. Our preference is to invest in slightly smaller footprint projects. So in some ways, they can sit under the radar, because the reason that you often need permits is either if you're building a massive thing, which we've tended to avoid companies that need to build enormous infrastructure, or if you're disposing of very large volumes of water. And if your footprint's a bit smaller, then that's significantly less challenging. So I think we recognize the importance of regulatory aspects, but we tend to invest in projects where they're not going to be held up in permitting. So effectively, it's a different way of managing permitting risk by focusing on footprints with smaller environmental footprints.
Roy, do you have anything to add in terms of how national policy or local policy can play a big factor in your decision making?
It obviously has, based on that we have a footprint on a global scale. We are involved in several countries from Asia and Africa and South America, North America and Europe and all the way around. So we obviously need to adapt into the difference between the countries and the region. But it has obviously a huge impact on the political environment. You are going to raise a farm. If it's stable, are you sure that the permit is not drawn back? Is there an exposure on that? So for us, it's a part of the due diligence on the exposure of every case. How is the environmental application being treated, and what is the vision? Can you have a good long-term solution, or is it a short-term one? This is obviously having an impact on our appetite and risk.
All right. It's time for us to wrap up. So I want to thank our panelists for sharing their expertise. If we weren't able to answer your questions, hopefully they will be able to answer them themselves. If you can send them a private chat on our Feed Loop platform today. So we are now entering our second network break of the day. Just a reminder to all of you that all our speakers are available throughout the day. So if you have a chance to get your question, send them a private message on our networking page. Outside of our main schedule, we also have our experts and exhibitors who are also available to you. If you haven't browsed through our on-demand presentations just yet, or our booth tours, or visit the exhibit hall, there's lots of content available for you during our break. So go ahead and stretch, get a coffee refill, water refill, and I'll see you in our next presentation in 15 minutes. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you, Jean and Roy and Jamie.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Jean. Thanks, Erik. Thanks.